As the king and queen leave the thrones and head for the exit of Westminster Abbey of the coronation ceremony, you'll see that everyone bows and curtsies to the king, and no one moves a limb, a muscle, when Camilla passes.
The meeting was supposed to settle a private disagreement before it escaped the palace walls. Instead, it became the moment restraint collapsed. With senior members of the royal council watching, Camilla turned directly toward Prince William and delivered a furious personal rebuke that stunned the room. Charles tried to intervene. William refused to retreat, and within seconds, a discussion about royal authority had transformed into something far more dangerous. A family confrontation nobody could pretend was private anymore. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had called the gathering because the tension around William's growing role could no longer be ignored. The Royal Council, senior figures brought together to advise the monarch on institutional matters, was meant to give the king control over a dispute that had become personal. He wanted clear boundaries around his household. The prince wanted clarity about decisions shaping the future. Camilla wanted something just as important to her, proof that her place beside her husband was not being quietly reduced. Camilla did not wait for the discussion to soften. She turned toward William and accused him of undermining Charles, pushing past his proper role, and behaving as though the crown already belonged to him. The queen consort's words landed with brutal force, because they questioned more than judgment. They questioned loyalty. He remained seated for a moment, stunned, then asked in a low voice whether she truly believed he was betraying his father. She did not retreat. Charles snapped. He pushed back his chair and ordered Camilla to stop, but the damage had already spread across the room. The king's anger was not only the insult. He understood what every council member had just witnessed. His wife challenging his heir in front of people whose confidence mattered to the stability of his reign. William, meanwhile, noticed something even more disturbing. She was using language he had heard before. The prince recognized one phrase immediately. Days earlier, during a closed conversation in Charles's study, his father had warned him not to behave as though the future had already arrived. Now Camilla repeated almost the same words. His anger cooled into suspicion. Charles saw the change in his son's face, and knew the argument had moved somewhere far more dangerous. The king ended the meeting abruptly. Chairs shifted, voices died, and the room emptied. William stayed behind. He looked at his father and asked the question that changed everything. How much did you tell her? The confrontation had exploded before the council, but its deepest consequences were about to begin behind a closed door. Behind the titles were three people trapped inside three very different fears. Charles feared becoming irrelevant before his reign had fully taken shape. Camilla feared being pushed toward the edge of a future monarchy she could never control. William feared something deeper, that protecting the institution might eventually require opposing his own father. The council confrontation was shocking, but the emotions underneath it had been growing for much longer, and each person had entered that room carrying private wounds. Charles carried the heaviest contradiction. He had prepared William for greater responsibility, yet every sign of the prince's growing influence reminded the king that succession was not abstract. It meant surrendering authority he had waited decades to hold. The monarchy's line of succession, the order determining who inherits the throne, made William's future unavoidable. Staff now sought his judgment on long-term planning, and that shift mattered because decisions made today could shape the institution after Charles was gone. Camilla felt that shift differently. She had fought for acceptance and a place beside the monarch, only to sense that some already viewed her influence as temporary. The queen consort, the title used for the wife of a reigning king, heard William's calm restraint in the council room as something colder. To her, his silence felt like judgment. She returned to a sitting room furious, but anger soon gave way to unease. Charles sat alone after the meeting and removed his glasses. He placed them beside an untouched folder and admitted to an aide that he could not understand how a dispute over responsibilities had turned into an attack on his son. The king sounded less angry now than wounded. He had wanted boundaries. Instead, he had watched his wife and heir expose a fracture he could no longer ignore. William found Catherine later and said what troubled him most. The insult was painful, but Camilla's knowledge was worse. The princess listened as he explained that some phrases used against him had come from confidential conversations with his father. Catherine immediately understood the danger. If discussions between the future king and the monarch were no longer private, trust itself had become unstable. Catherine asked the question he had been avoiding. Had Charles deliberately shared those conversations? William did not answer. His silence revealed more than denial could have. Memory surfaced. Weeks earlier, Camilla had repeated information from a separate private exchange she should never have known. The prince suddenly understood that the council explosion had not begun that morning. To understand why the room became a battlefield, everything now led back to one earlier evening, when a private conversation crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The real beginning did not happen at the council table. It happened weeks earlier, after a royal reception had ended and the palace had grown quiet. William asked Charles for 10 private minutes. No advisors, no secretaries, no intermediaries. What followed was meant to remain between father and son. But before the next morning was over, William discovered that one of his most sensitive concerns had already reached Camilla. From that moment forward, trust stopped being assumed. William had been carrying the concern for weeks. Staff lines were beginning to overlap, and decisions about appointments were drifting between the king's household and the team preparing for the next reign. Succession planning, the process of preparing people, duties, and structures for the next monarch, mattered because one careless overlap could turn preparation into a struggle for control. The prince wanted those boundaries settled before resentment hardened. Charles agreed to hear him privately after the reception. The king expected a conversation, but not an accusation against his marriage. William chose his words carefully and said Camilla must not influence appointments tied directly to the future Prince of Wales' household and long-term succession planning. His father stiffened. To him, the request sounded less like administration and more like an attempt to push his wife outside the circle of trust. William refused that interpretation. He told Charles this was about institutional boundaries, not affection, status, or loyalty. The prince insisted that family relationships could not decide who shaped the machinery of a future reign. The king heard the logic, but the wound remained. He defended Camilla fiercely, and the conversation ended without agreement, leaving both men convinced the other had misunderstood something essential. Camilla confronted William the next morning in a corridor. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The queen consort repeated the phrase succession planning with unmistakable bitterness and asked whether he truly believed she had no place in decisions affecting the future. He stopped cold. Only 2 people had heard those exact words the night before. William understood the danger. Either Charles had repeated the conversation, or privacy inside the palace was far weaker than he believed. Neither possibility reassured him. From that day, the future king began withholding details from his father, while Camilla became convinced he intended to isolate her from royal decision-making. Charles watched both relationships deteriorate. By the time he called the council meeting, the king was trying to contain a conflict already poisoned by mistrust. Camilla entered believing she had one chance to confront William before his influence became impossible to challenge. That breach changed everything, and when they met before the council, restraint was already gone. When Charles ended the council meeting, nobody moved immediately. The silence was too heavy. Camilla remained rigid. William stared toward the table rather than at his father. Then the king ordered everyone except the 2 of them to leave. The doors closed. What followed was not a constitutional discussion or a debate over protocol. It was a husband confronting his wife, a father confronting his son, and a monarch discovering that authority could not repair broken trust. Charles watched the council members file out without speaking. The council, a senior advisory gathering used here to discuss matters affecting the monarch's household and authority, had just witnessed a family dispute become an institutional crisis. That mattered because any fracture between the king and his heir could weaken confidence inside the palace. William rose to leave too, but his father stopped him with a sharp command. For Dequagen. Camilla stayed seated, refusing to apologize. Charles turned toward Camilla and finally said what he had been holding back. You attacked my son in a room where he could not answer you without damaging me. The king's voice began low, almost controlled, but anger pushed through every word. She fired back that William had been weakening her position for months, questioning her influence and treating her place beside the monarch as temporary. He listened, jaw tight, until the accusation became unbearable. William stood. The prince told Camilla that boundaries were not humiliation and disagreement was not betrayal. He said he had never challenged her marriage, her public role, or her place beside Charles. What he had challenged was her involvement in decisions tied directly to his future responsibilities. The queen consort looked toward her husband as if expecting him to intervene. Instead, he asked the question that changed everything. Charles demanded to know how she had learned the exact contents of his private conversation with William. Camilla paused. That silence cut deeper than any denial. She finally admitted that the king had spoken to her afterward, and had repeated the substance of what his son had said. He had never told her to keep it private, she insisted. William slowly turned toward his father. The prince did not need another explanation. His suspicion was confirmed. Charles had shared the conversation, even if he had never intended it to become ammunition. The king now faced a choice with no painless answer: defend his wife, repair trust with his heir, or draw a boundary that would permanently reduce Camilla's access to royal decision-making. Charles had lost control of the meeting. His next decision would determine whether he could regain control of the monarchy around it, before the damage spread beyond those closed doors. Royal power rarely announces itself with shouting. More often, it appears through access. Who enters the room? Who receives the papers? Who hears the conversation before anyone else? After the confrontation, Charles understood that the crisis could not be solved with another argument. He needed structure. William needed assurance. Camilla wanted respect. And somewhere inside that triangle sat the question nobody wanted to say aloud. When family loyalty clashes with institutional responsibility, whose authority actually comes first? Charles began reviewing every practical boundary the argument had exposed. Council participation, briefing circulation, and private advisory access now carried new weight because each determined who could influence decisions before they reached the monarch. Briefing circulation, the controlled sharing of official papers and sensitive information, mattered because access could quietly become power. The king knew that one careless overlap could turn family tension into a permanent struggle over authority. William refused to demand punishment. He told Catherine privately that if he pushed for Camilla to be excluded, the move would look like a son trying to seize control from his father. The prince wanted trust restored, not revenge. Catherine understood the danger immediately. She warned him that even a justified demand could be twisted into proof that he was already acting like a sovereign before his time. Charles sat alone with the briefing papers spread before him. He turned the same page twice, then a third time, without absorbing a word. Finally, the king set down his pen. Every option hurt someone he loved. Protect Camilla completely, and William might never trust him again. Restrict her access, and his wife could believe he had chosen his heir over her. Camilla confronted Charles in private before he could summon her. She asked whether her involvement was being reduced simply because William had been offended. The queen consort's voice was steady, but the hurt beneath it was unmistakable. He answered that offense was not the issue. The question was whether confidential planning could remain confidential once it crossed from one relationship into another. Charles made the decision. Future succession discussions involving William would be limited to people explicitly named for each meeting, and Camilla would no longer receive automatic access simply because she was his wife. The king then imposed a second boundary. The prince's expanding role did not allow him to bypass the sovereign or treat preparation as present authority. Camilla heard the final terms without protest. She did not argue. She did not demand reconsideration. That silence unsettled Charles more than anger would have. The structure was restored on paper, but behind one palace door, she was about to understand exactly what those new boundaries had cost her. The loudest moment had passed, yet the palace felt more fragile afterward. Camilla was no longer fighting across a table. Charles was no longer shouting. William was no longer defending himself before witnesses. Instead, the consequences arrived quietly. Altered schedules, smaller meetings, closed doors, fewer conversations. And for Camilla, one ordinary line on a revised briefing sheet made the reality unavoidable. Her name had disappeared from a meeting she had assumed she would attend beside her husband. Camilla read the revised schedule once, then again. Succession planning, the controlled preparation for the duties, staff, and structure surrounding the next reign, had now been narrowed to a smaller group, chosen directly by Charles. No public punishment was announced. No statement accused her of wrongdoing. Yet everyone close to the household understood what the change meant. The council confrontation had redrawn the internal lines of trust. Camilla turned the page face down and asked her secretary to leave. The queen consort remained alone after the door closed, staring at the table as humiliation replaced anger. She had expected resistance from William. She had not expected Charles to create a boundary that excluded her from discussions she once assumed would naturally include her. For the first time, the cost of the confrontation felt personal rather than political. Charles entered later and found her unusually quiet. The king asked if she wanted to talk, and she answered without looking at him. Camilla said she had defended him because she believed William was treating his father like a monarch already being replaced. She had heard the future in every new appointment, every private discussion, every question directed toward the prince, and fear had convinced her that silence meant surrender. Charles answered with a truth she had not expected. William had never asked for her removal from the king's personal life, her public role, or her place beside him. The prince had challenged only her access to confidential succession discussions. That distinction mattered because one was about marriage and dignity, the other was about institutional boundaries. Camilla finally understood how completely she had merged the two. Camilla lowered her eyes. Her attack had not protected her influence. It had strengthened the very separation she feared, giving Charles a reason to formalize limits that might otherwise have remained flexible. The realization left her quieter than any argument could have. William received a message that same evening. Charles wanted to see him alone. No staff, no Camilla, no papers between them. This time, there would be no witnesses. For the first time since the council erupted, father and son would meet without anyone standing between them, and neither could hide behind royal procedure. There were no council members this time. No secretaries waiting outside with folders. No Camilla. No Catherine. Just Charles and William, seated across from one another in a private room where the argument could no longer be disguised as royal administration. The king did not begin by defending himself. The prince did not begin with accusations. For several seconds, neither spoke at all. Then Charles admitted the truth that had been buried beneath every argument. He feared losing his son long before losing his throne. Charles had asked for the meeting because rules could repair process, but they could not repair trust. Briefing protocols, the formal rules controlling who receives sensitive royal information, had already been tightened. That solved one problem. It did not solve the deeper one. The king knew William could follow every procedure and still walk away believing his father was no longer safe to confide in. That possibility frightened him more than any dispute over authority. William arrived expecting another conversation about duties and limits. The prince had prepared himself to discuss succession, staff, and responsibility, yet his father had placed no papers between them. Charles told him he had repeated part of their earlier private conversation to Camilla because he had felt trapped between being a husband and being the monarch. He admitted that intention did not excuse the result. He had broken an expectation of privacy. William did not answer quickly. When he finally spoke, he told Charles that Camilla's attack had hurt, but it was not the deepest wound. The future king could survive disagreement. What he could not accept was wondering whether every honest conversation with his father might later become part of another argument. He said that doubt had already changed the way he spoke to him, and both men understood how dangerous that distance could become. Charles apologized without qualification. The king did not blame pressure, marriage, or misunderstanding. He promised that when William explicitly asked for a conversation to remain private, it would remain between them. That simple admission removed the uncertainty that had poisoned every exchange since the first breach. For once, the prince did not have to guess what his father meant. William answered with an admission of his own. He accepted that his growing responsibilities could sometimes feel threatening, especially to a monarch who had waited so long to reign. The prince promised to separate preparation for the future from authority belonging to the present sovereign. Charles heard respect rather than surrender. Charles stopped William before he left. He said he still had one conversation to face, this time with Camilla as a husband rather than a king. The institution had found its boundary. Now the family needed something harder. Hurt admitted without another battle over who was right. Private royal conflicts rarely stay private once enough people have witnessed them. By the following day, fragments of the council confrontation had escaped into public conversation. The details were incomplete, but the image was irresistible. A furious Camilla confronting William, Charles losing patience, and a meeting ending abruptly. Outside the palace, The argument became something larger than one family dispute. It became a public symbol of succession, loyalty, marriage, and the uncomfortable transition between two royal generations. Charles moved quickly to contain the damage. Palace communications, the official system used to explain royal activity and respond to public attention, described the meeting only as a private discussion about household responsibilities. The king refused to authorize language that blamed either William or Camilla. That choice mattered because one harsh statement could turn a family dispute into an open institutional split, while silence risked allowing speculation to fill the gap. William watched the coverage beside Catherine and said very little. The princess noticed that attacks on him barely seemed to register, but commentary portraying Charles as weak clearly did. One panel suggested the monarch had lost control of both his household and his heir. The prince reached for the remote and switched off the television before the speaker finished. Catherine understood then that his anger had shifted. He no longer wanted victory. He wanted his father protected. Camilla faced something harder. She heard commentators describe her confrontation as insecurity disguised as authority, and for once, the queen consort did not answer the criticism with anger. Embarrassment settled in. She began to understand how the council members may have seen that moment, not as a defense of Charles, but as fear made public. The story peaked the next morning. A newspaper front page carried a stark photograph of Charles and William leaving separate engagements beneath the headline, "The Crown Divided." At Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates, while broadcasters repeated the same question. Had a private family rupture become a constitutional problem? The king refused to fuel that narrative. Charles chose containment. No public rebuke followed. No formal punishment was announced against Camilla, and William was not accused of disloyalty. The monarch's refusal to humiliate either side signaled something important. Reconciliation had become more valuable than revenge. Camilla made the next move. That evening, she asked Charles for one final private conversation, then told him she wanted William brought in afterward. Not for another confrontation, not to defend herself. She wanted to give him something she had resisted from the beginning. Public judgment had already arrived. The final verdict would come from the three people at the center of the crisis. The final meeting was smaller than the one that started everything. There was no council, no audience, and nowhere for pride to perform. Charles sat between the woman he loved and the son who would one day inherit everything he carried. Camilla spoke first. William listened. And in that quiet exchange, the crisis became understandable for what it truly was. Not a battle over titles, but three people terrified that the future of the crown might leave one of them behind. Charles made the final arrangement clear. Camilla would remain his wife, queen consort, and trusted companion, but confidential succession discussions involving William would operate under strict boundaries. The queen consort, the title held by the wife of a reigning king, would keep her place beside him. Yet planning for the future reign would be limited to those responsible. The king had separated marriage from institutional authority. William accepted his own limit. The prince acknowledged that preparing for the future could never become a substitute for respecting the sovereign who still carried the crown. He understood that anticipation could look like impatience, and responsibility could look like ambition when fear entered the room. Charles heard that admission without defensiveness. Now father and son were no longer measuring who had won. Camilla then faced William and apologized. She did not abandon every disagreement, but she admitted that fear of exclusion had turned a question of boundaries into a personal accusation. The queen consort told him she should never have questioned his loyalty to Charles before the council. He accepted the apology without triumph and answered that disagreement was inevitable, but attacking his devotion to his father had crossed a line he could not ignore. Charles took responsibility next. The king admitted that he had repeated a confidential conversation and allowed tension between his wife and heir to grow because confronting it earlier would have been painful. His avoidance had made the explosion worse. Together, the three agreed on a permanent rule. Family concerns would be discussed as family. Constitutional responsibilities would follow defined channels, and private conversations would not be carried carelessly from one relationship into another. The confrontation did not destroy the monarchy. It forced its central figures to speak the boundaries they had once assumed. Charles regained control through responsibility, not force. Camilla lost influence in one narrow arena, but preserved dignity through accountability. William gained clarity without needing victory. What began as an attack became the moment that stopped fear from hardening into permanent division between all three of them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.